is Oromo Voice Radio English program.
Welcome to Oromia Insight. My name is Ali Galato. Today I will present to you Aljazeera report on state of emergency in Ethiopia and media resort to propaganda to hide the truth, Irrecha Oromo Festival 2016 by Teflan Zergan.
የጸጥታ ኃይሎቻችን ጸጥታ እንዲከበር ለማድረግ ከፍተኛ ጥረት ያደረጉበት ምንም አይነት የጥይት ድምጽ ያልተሰማበት ምንም አይነት የጥይት ድምጽ ያልተሰማበት ምንም አይነት የጥይት ድምጽ ያልተሰማበት
Now let's see what we got inside here.
On the International Day that was supposed to be marked by non-violence, on the day when millions of Oromos come together to celebrate their annual Thanksgiving festival, Ethiopia was rocked with state-sanctioned violence, where hundreds of Oromos were systematically driven to their tragic deaths. As usual, a lot of the mainstream media outlets resorted to disinformation, propaganda and lies when reporting on the massacre that occurred at the Aija festival. Instead of reporting on the orchestrated tragedy, as it is, the word stampede was parroted throughout the mainstream media, without properly delving into and highlighting the main cause of the tragedy, which was the coordinated use of helicopters, armored vehicles, bullets and tear gas that drove these innocent civilians to their deaths.
Let me first say that this was clearly not an accident. And you have 2 million people in a very crowded, very small place. On one side you have a lake, on the other side you have ditches and cliffs. And you fire a tear gas in warning shots at a crowd that is angry, crowd that was passionately chanting and protesting all day. You should expect the result. This is pre-planned because the government has said that they expected the protest to continue at the Irrecha. They they expected this to happen, but they planned and brought in helicopters were flying above the crowd at a very low height all day long. There were tanks on the street. There were armored vehicles on the side of the street. So they clearly planned for this. And people who were there are saying that the number of security forces on that stage, around that stage, around the crowd, is almost as many as the crowd that was gathered there.
That is very disturbing.
So it is very hard for me to sit here and say that this was an accident.
When referring to the number of deaths, the mainstream media decided to regurgitate the figure given by the well-known, pathological liars ruling Ethiopia. The number 52 became a popular number amongst the corporate media. This is despite the fact that reports and witnesses from the ground have been putting the death toll in the hundreds and hundreds of innocent men, women and children massacred in the most horrific way one can only imagine.
Kan immoo godaatin irra geelle hospitaala kan jiran ammallee baay'ee lubbuun isaanii baay'ee kan eegamu. Isaanuu baay'ee kan amarra. Ammas kan hin argamne immoo namoota baay'ee. Dhaaraniiru warroonni dhaaranii jiru hin jira si homaa homtu baay'ee gaddaniiru. Beeksam gara baadiyyaa amma nama maatiin tokko nama reeffa 5 fudhatee galeetu jira. Mana tokko keessatti jechuudha ijoollee 5 erga tokko ulfaana dhumanii. Kanaafuu baay'ee aadaniirra homaa godhuu hin dandeenye garuu.
Here's a clear example of disinformation and propaganda. Besides the worn-out word stampede and number 52, this article from Reuters claims that some people had chanted slogans against the government. The key word here is some, as if it was a small number of people chanting anti-TPLF slogans. Let's have a look and see for ourselves if it's only some people chanting against the government. The same article then goes on to say that protesters had chanted slogans against the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, one of the 4 regional parties that make up the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, which has ruled the country for quarter of a century. Well, why don't we go back and have a look, and hear what exactly other sea of hundreds of thousands of Oromos are chanting. The question that arises now is, why would an Ethiopian working for Reuters, deep inside Ethiopia, not report on the main demands of the roaring patriotic Oromos, which can be heard from miles away, calling for the fall of the #1 enemy of Ethiopia, the criminal TPLF? Not only did he not mention the down TPLF chants, but he resorted to using propaganda and lies to misinform the general public, concealing the gravity of the horrific crime perpetrated against innocent Oromo men, women and children. One can only wonder why a supposed journalist would stoop so low and go do something like that. It's not only Reuters. You would hardly find a single article from the mainstream media that talked about the main demand and chants of the Oromo people, which was It's quite obvious that they didn't want to inform their audiences of the real demands of the Oromo people, and the deep hatred they have for the criminal TPLF regime, which has been slaughtering Oromos for a while now. Again, why is that? Why have the mainstream media failed to mention TPLF? Is it because of the fact that it's a Western puppet that was poured a lot of resources and time into it, to be the most obedient puppet in Africa, if not the world? That explains the deafening silence from the country that likes to portray itself as the champion of human rights and democracy. The country that has been constantly resuscitating the criminal TPLF regime with billions of dollars in aid throughout the years, also providing the TPLF regime the political and diplomatic shield to continue its lawlessness, criminal activities in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. This has subsequently awakened the consciousness of a large portion of the Ethiopian population. They now see the double standards of the US and its complete disregard of Ethiopian lives, who continue to be killed by its puppet regime. This, however, will not stop the Amaras. It will not stop the Oromo. It will not stop the Ethiopian revolution. It will only strengthen the people's resolve to finish off what they have started, which is the removal of the puppet criminal regime, TPLF, and bringing them to justice. Would just like to remind our Ethiopian brothers and sisters that they have not been totally abandoned. The truth seekers and justice lovers around the world are by your side. Eritreans have a lot of experience in terms of this type of injustices being committed against them, so we fully understand what our Oromo and Amara brothers and sisters are going through. That's why our moral support in your fight against injustices will never cease.
But first, Madam Gomes, you have a point.
President, last Sunday at the Iriesha festival in Ethiopia, it ended in a massacre. According to Oromo sources, 678 people were killed by security forces, shooting the crowd in cold blood and causing a stampede. Other 700 people have been murdered in Ethiopia in the past 10 months, as marathon runner Faiza Lileza denounced at the Rio Olympics. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the African Commission for Human Rights have called for independent observers to enter the country and to assess the situation and for an impartial investigation. The EU, which is actually paying with lots of taxpayers' money via ODA, is silent, and that silence is deafening. Will you, Mr. President, on our behalf, speak up in solidarity with the repressed people of Ethiopia and call for an international independent investigation into the Eritrea massacre and the ongoing repression in Ethiopia?
Returning now to one of our main stories on this news hour and the situation in Ethiopia, where the government has declared a state of emergency after weeks of anti-government protests. Rights groups say more than 500 people have died in Ethiopia in the last year following protests by the Oromia people against the Ethiopian government. Let's now bring in our next guest on this news hour, Mohammed Ademo, who's the editor of the All Pride website, a news website that focuses on Ethiopia. He joins us live from Washington, D.C. Good to have you, Mohammed. Just remind us first of what's behind this wave of protests that we've seen in the last year in Ethiopia. What's triggered the unrest?
The unrest was initially triggered by the central government's decision to expand the capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, into the Oromia region. And when people protested or opposed the expansion, the government responded by arresting Oromo leaders, Oromo activists, and then also cracking down heavily on protesters and killing protesters, as
right.
You've mentioned.
But that plan was dropped, though, by the government. That plan to expand
yes,
the capital was dropped by the government, and yet the protests continued.
Yes, I think the crackdown, the repressive measures that the security forces took actually angered people, in the grievances and the demands of the protesters sort of shifted to historic marginalization of the Oromo people, in Oromo being the majority in that country, not having enough power, enough say in the economy, in the politics of that country. And as you know, the government is dominated by ethnic group, a few elite from minority ethnic Tigrayan group, and all of this led to more resentment and brought forth demands for democracy, demands for rule of law. In the government response so far have been only one way, which is raining bullets on protesters, which are mostly peaceful. And as you've seen in the past couple of days, the protests have now shifted, and the people are tired of peacefully demanding for respect for their rights.
Sorry to interrupt you. You say the protests have been mostly peaceful, which is true. But in the last few days, we've seen protesters attacking foreign companies. I mean, what's the point of that? What are they going to achieve by attacking foreign companies?
Yes, Ethiopia is held up as the rising star in the continent of Africa. And some of the legitimacy for its economic record comes from attracting foreign investment, giving land to foreigners, massive amounts of land to foreigners by displacing locals. And the GDP numbers don't necessarily reflect the reality on the ground, and the poor people, the average Ethiopians, are not benefiting from the development. So people are now saying that this is only here to legitimize the government rule, and it's about time that people start hitting the government where it hurts, and also putting foreign investors on notice, because Ethiopia is not an ideal climate for investment, and Ethiopia's development state has backfired, and you cannot keep people repressed and deny their rights and shut down the media, shut down the opposition, and continue to project an image of a country that is growing, and the growth is only benefiting people who are on power.
But the risk is, of course, Mohammed, as you know, is that we're going to see more deaths. I mean, more than 500 people, according to various rights groups, have been killed in Ethiopia in the last year. A state of emergency is now in place for up to 6 months. Are the protests going to continue?
Folly. Look, more than 500 people have been killed in the last 4 days. And what we are looking at in Ethiopia is a war. We don't know exactly what is on the ground, or the media is not seeing the reports that we are getting from people on the ground, because the internet has been shut down. Yes, we are going to see more killing. We are going to unfortunately see more bloodshed. And if you just look at the reason for declaring the state of emergency, this gives police and the security forces the right to kill and detain anyone they so choose, which they've been doing so far already, but this just allows them to do more of that, and we are going to see more arrests. we are going to see more killings. The protesters are not backing down, and people are tired of getting killed. And they want the regime to end, and they are the government, obviously, as you've seen, is not heeding the protesters' grievances, and they are continuing to just crack down more heavily and bring more security forces to the street. And if someone kills your brother, someone kills your cousin, and you see them walking around with AK-47, that endangers more anger. It doesn't calm the situation. So I think, unfortunately, Ethiopia is headed in a very wrong direction, and this is going to have a ripple effect across the region, and is very, very deeply concerning at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for hearing. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us, Mohammed Ademo of the news website All Pride, joining us there live from Washington.